Well, the BOI case is now at the U.S. Supreme Court. The federal government, who lost at the Fifth Circuit, has appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the federal government's position right now, and make sure everyone understands this, is saying, hey, individuals, business owners that have an LLC or corporation, you must file a BOI with the federal government, this agency called FinCEN, and this is its business owner information report that says who owns an LLC, 25% or more, or who has substantial control. Now, the Fifth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals, most recently at the end of December, said you do not need to file this. This is likely unconstitutional, and there is an emergency injunction order against the federal government that says they cannot enforce this law right now. Now, the plaintiffs in the case have filed their response to the government, of course, saying this law is unconstitutional. And there have also been 25 states that have filed their own briefs to the court and have said this law is unconstitutional. This is not the jurisdiction of the federal government. We set up entities, LLCs and corporations at the state level. This is our business. Federal government, get out of it. Now, here's the status now in mid-January. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has set this for oral argument out in late March. The federal government doesn't like waiting until March. Instead, they're saying, hey, U.S. Supreme Court, take the case now and you decide the case. Or in the alternative right now, overturn the Fifth Circuit, make them go through their process and their hearing in March. And in the meantime, everyone has to file BOIs. Now, that is what the federal government is asking for effectively in their appeal. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court does not have to take the case. This is called a writ of certiorari. This is basically a request to the U.S. Supreme Court to say, hey, hear this case. Now, typically the U.S. Supreme Court is going to say, let the lower courts figure it out first. Let the Fifth Circuit figure it out. If anyone doesn't like the result there, the plaintiffs or the federal government, then they can appeal to us at the U.S. Supreme Court, and we'll only hear the case then. However, the U.S. Supreme Court sometimes will come down and grab a case before it is fully adjudicated in the lower court of appeals. And that is what the federal government is trying to get to happen here. Now, they have to convince one justice. That one justice is Justice Samuel Alito. Now, the reason they have to get through one justice first is when you submit a writ of certiorari, there's a justice designated for each circuit. Now, the Fifth Circuit happens to be the circuit Justice Alito is designated. So he is the one that determines whether the full U.S. Supreme Court is going to hear or take the case or not. Now, for those of you that don't want the BOI requirement and you want it to be unconstitutional, this is probably your justice. Because what do people know about Justice Alito? Anti-federal government, does not like federal government overreach, believes in states' rights. He is someone likely to rule in favor of the plaintiffs and find this law unconstitutional, which would mean you would not have to file your BOI for your LLC or corporation. Now, since the U.S. Supreme Court has been accepting all of these amicus briefs, they have not determined whether there's going to be oral argument or set a timeline on this. It is up to the U.S. Supreme Court and, frankly, Justice Alito on how he wants to schedule and decide this. But what we have on the other end of this is the Fifth Circuit that has this scheduled for late March for oral argument. After oral argument, then the judges still deliberate, decide, and then you finally get an opinion. So we know some certainty of what the Fifth Circuit is doing, but there's some uncertainty of what the U.S. Supreme Court is doing. But right now, I want to make sure everyone understands, there is not a legal requirement to file a BOI. The current federal court injunction says that FinCEN cannot enforce this BOI filing requirement against any corporation or LLC owner. Now, if you're someone that's already filed your BOI, there's frankly nothing to do. Don't worry about this. But maybe you're going to be setting up a new entity in 2025 or sometime in the future. Does this matter to you? Or maybe you're someone that didn't even file the BOI for your prior entity because you believed it was going to be ruled unconstitutional. What should you be doing? Well, you should be subscribing to my channel and monitoring this case at the very least. And I'm going to be providing updates here about what you should do, and I'll be on it for any updates or rulings that are going to be coming from the court. Of course, any filing deadlines that might come up if this law comes back into effect. But the tricky thing for business owners, real estate investors, attorneys, other professionals is, do we even file this BOI now? Like, what advice should we give? If you're someone setting up a new business next month, do you file this thing or not? You have a 30-day window in 2025 now after the time for when you set up your LLC or corporation with the state to file this BOI with the state. Now, the federal government's saying, still file it with us. They're accepting voluntary submissions of the BOI report. Should you do that? Now, some people have taken the road of, let me just file the damn thing. I don't want to track this or monitor it. I'm just going to file it. And I get that perspective. You could take that approach. Other people are like, I'm only filing if I absolutely have to, and once this case is fully adjudicated. If you're in that camp, I totally understand that too. That's likely where I'm going to be on any new entities that I might be setting up. Now, I'll say this. I filed dozens of these for my own entities. We filed thousands of them for our law firm clients and clients of our corporate compliance business, Main Street Business Services. Like, we filed thousands of these because you had to. It wasn't until December of 2024, 20 days before the deadline to file your LLC or corporation, that we heard a federal judge in Texas first rule this unconstitutional. Since then, it's gone back and forth. The Fifth Circuit said, actually, it is constitutional and overturned the district court. Then another panel of the Fifth Circuit said, no, it is unconstitutional, which is where we're sitting now, and there's no requirement to file a BOI. And then the federal government has now appealed this to the U.S. Supreme Court. So in the last month, there has been whipsaw on this back and forth about whether you need to file a BOI. Now, because of the huge interest in this case, because it affects so many small business owners in the U.S., because 25 states have filed an amicus brief saying it's unconstitutional, you think the U.S. Supreme Court is likely to grant this. Now, they may punt it. That might be a strategy for the U.S. Supreme Court to say, you know what? Let's let the Fifth Circuit figure it out. And if they decide on it right, we won't take the case. We'll just let that Fifth Circuit opinion lie. Who knows, though? This is all speculation. But if you've been looking at what's happening in the U.S. Supreme Court right now, they're getting more conservative. They're getting more limited federal government, states' rights-oriented type decisions, which is the type of court that goes in favor of this BOI requirement being ruled unconstitutional, finally, at the U.S. Supreme Court. There is nowhere else to appeal once that order comes down from the U.S. Supreme Court. Also, around the corner here, we have a new Trump administration, a new Department of Justice, a new Treasury Department, which FinCEN is the division where you file your BOI. It is part of the Treasury Department. Who knows how they're going to enforce it? They may relax some of these things or remove the requirements that you have to file this. The Department of Justice might say, you know what? We are going to rely on this federal court order right now and pull back all these appeals. Let's let this thing die out. So make sure you're staying tuned on this requirement. I'm going to be updating you here, of course, on my channel. And by the way, I've got so many tips that I'm giving you on legal strategies, asset protection strategies, tax strategies, how to grow and build wealth. Please subscribe to my channel, not just for the BOI, but for all those other great insights and tips I'm providing. I'm Matt Sorensen. We'll see you next time.